proficiency-based assessment. He's an advisor to Competency Works, and he has quite an impressive bio in the world of progressive education. David's going to be joined after a presentation on giving us sort of some context, the New England context and the proficiency-based education work there, from Mary Ann Snider, who's Deputy Commissioner for the Rhode Island Department of Education. And Mary Ann has been involved in a statewide effort that's focused on student-centered learning and proficiency-based education. She's leading up the ESSA plans for the state of Rhode Island, and she's a former special education educator. So I think we can move to the next slide, Cora, and hand it over to David, and we can also start the recording. So thank you all.
Great. Welcome everybody. It's good to hear all your voices out there and coming out of the Midwest as we're sitting here in the chilly Northeast at this point. I'm going to go through a few slides pretty quickly and then turn over to Mary Ann to go through some of those. And as Wendy has noted, we're going to go through these quickly so we can turn to you, and we're happy to go back and talk about any of those. But just to give you a sense, and I think it's important to know that while a lot of this has been a state effort, it's really been a collaborative state effort that has been undertaken in connection with the New England Secondary School Consortium. That includes us, the Great Schools Partnership, and our role is to help facilitate this. The state departments of education in Connecticut, Maine, Rhode Island, New Hampshire, and Vermont. Massachusetts is starting to be involved in this and may be joining in that, but at this point is not. And together that creates the New England Secondary School Consortium. Next slide. And so we, as I said, we are the coordinator of the New England Secondary School Consortium. It's important to know that we coordinate the efforts, but it's really a state-led effort and walking between the fine line between the state autonomy and state collaboration to move this work forward. And I would note in the next bullet here that Rhode Island has been a member of the NESSC since we started in 2009, and I would say we probably spent a year at that time trying to figure out exactly what it was, where we wanted to go, why we wanted to have it, all that. And Rhode Island, our colleagues in Rhode Island have been really instrumental in helping to shape all of this. The goals that we have for the consortium are pretty straightforward. It's to increase the graduation rate, increase college enrollment rate, and to decrease the dropout rate. And we actually set, each state has separate goals that are dependent upon where they start, although the growth measure is the same across all of them that we're aiming at. And so the actual number and the target differs, the intent is the same. Our vision is to have a college and career readiness for all students in our 5 states through, and this is a key piece, the leverage points that we see: proficiency-based graduation, multiple and flexible pathways, and learner-centered accountability systems. Just a moment on this one here. Proficiency-based, some people would call it competency, some would call it mastery. In New England, it goes by all 3 of those, and we would argue that there is no difference between those two beyond the politics that are associated with each of those names in the various different states. I know that there are some people who would say there are significant differences between them, but in our work and our experience here, there is not. And these 3 really fit together with the way that, you know, proficiency says, here's what we want kids to know and be able to do. The pathways opens up how kids could get there, and then an accountability system ensures that we're actually getting there and we're not creating rich and thoughtful pathways for some kids and less rich and thoughtful pathways for other kids. Now, part of the NESSC is the League of Innovative Schools. The NESSC simultaneously works on policy, practice, and public engagement. The League of Innovative Schools is our way to move forward with the practice arm of that. There are approximately 120 schools involved in that at this point. From all of our states, they actually come together in a state network and in a regional network to move their work forward. So they're looking to obviously strengthen their programs, exchange professional expertise, and create better learning opportunities for the kids. And it's really wonderful to see you know, an idea shared by one school, another school picks it up, hones and refines it, brings it back, and the original school actually furthers their work because they had the opportunity to share on that. When we take a look at personalization, which I think is at the core of this, we would argue the three pieces really fit together to get to personalized learning. And it's important to have all three of those. We're a little concerned that people have jumped on personalization and left some of these out, because you can have proficiency without being personalized. It's just to hear the standards, and we're going to tell you how to get there. If you have pathways without proficiency, we see inequity show up there. And again, if you don't have accountability to ensure that all the pieces are together, you're going to run into a problem. And then quickly, a few key documents for us. And I believe global best practices, you could connect here, but if you don't see it on the webinar, you can actually get that right off our website. But global best practices is essentially a self-assessment tool for schools to take a look at key characteristics, rate themselves on those, and to identify areas where they need to focus their energy and work. And then the final two pieces are about specifically about proficiency. Very briefly, we do entire workshops on this, and so I'll just take a moment to look at it. But the idea here is that when you say proficiency-based learning, the question is always of what standards? And we would say there are cross-curricular graduation standards, a small number of those, 5 to 8 of those. Then there are content area graduation standards, again, a small number of those, 5 to 8 in each content area. Each of those has aligned performance indicators which start to break that down. Performance indicators are where the assessment piece comes in because they're actually accessible, they're specific enough to be able to do that. And then each of those performance indicators is broken down into learning objectives, which really gets at the curriculum that's there. And so it's important to note on the left-hand side in terms of a graduation requirement or a promotion requirement from 8th grade to 9th grade, 5th grade to 6th grade. We're not worried about each individual learning objective and performance indicators, but in the aggregate around the content area graduation standards and the cross-curricular graduation standards. And then briefly, the next slide just talks about the assessment pathways, which is important because we could set up a system that was very tight around assessment that decreased opportunity for personalizing learning. But we look at here is the idea of those pathways, and there are really 4 pathways you could follow. Every kid doing the common learning experience, the same thing, demonstrating it in the same way, scored with common scoring guides, and we can get comparable results out of that. You could also have a common learning experience. They demonstrate it in different ways, use the same scoring criteria, unique learning experience, common demonstration, scoring, common scoring guide, and again, unique, and common. The key piece being there, the criteria on the standard is task neutral, so it can be used on all different types of evidence that kids create, and so that we open up the opportunities for personalization and flexibility to be able to move that work forward. I share those two pieces because I think to understand the work that's going on in New England around proficiency or competency or mastery, you've got to kind of get a framework. I want to be clear too, all the states interpret and use this work in ways that fit for them, so there isn't a commitment that will exactly be the exact same for everybody, but in general it provides us a framework to have conversations across states. So let me stop there, and I think, Wendy, you want to see if there are any questions you want to check in with people before we move to Mary Ann.
Yes, so feel free to unmute yourself if you have an important question for David or a comment you'd like to make before we move on to Mary Ann's presentation.
Hi, David. This is Buddy in Ohio. This is a great chart. I think both of these are very helpful in being able to capture visually, what's the essence of this work. And I'm interested in the valid and reliable results conclusion at the end of the unique learning experiences and unique scoring guide. That bottom line on that assessment pathway is simplified. Can you talk about how you ensure validity and reliability?
On option 5?
Yes.
Or just in general?
No, that's both, but option 5 in particular.
Yep. And so the let me just talk for a moment about option 5 there, in that we think there are times in a classroom where it'll be a unique learning experience, it'll be a unique demonstration task, and there may be some unique scoring criteria that are used there. So, Buddy, for example, I might be working with a student and I see the work that comes out, and I know the student has worked really hard, been focusing on this for a while, ready to go on to something new. As an instructional decision, I might say, that's great, let's move on here. But another student comes forth with what might be similar quality of work, but I might say, I think I need you to go back and work more on this. It's really more of a formative assessment check-in strategy there than it is a summative assessment in terms of verification of pieces there. As such, it can still be valid in terms of being attached to the original standards we were looking at. And the reliability really would be reliability within that student. The reliability across students is not very high at that point because I'm making some different decisions that are there. I think the key piece there that we would push is those first 4 pathways. And the notion of comparability for us is not so much, we don't want to say that Buddy has done a good job because Mark has not done a good job. And as I think that I would argue, I've been guilty of as a teacher, you know, the best is an A, the worst is not an A, but rather, so we don't want to make judgments on quality based on comparability, but we do want to have comparability so we can look and say, are different segments of our student population doing as well as other segments of our population, so that we can make sure that we are standing strong around equity.
Okay, thanks for that clarification.
Great. So, David, I think we should move on to Mary Ann's presentation. We have time for additional questions and discussions at the end. Buddy, thank you so much for your question.
Okay, hi everybody. So I am going to talk about Rhode Island's experience. We work closely with David and his team and have been really well supported by their thinking and guidance. But as you all know, coming from different states and different agencies, that how it plays out within your context, you know, will always shape things a little bit differently. So I'd like to talk about Rhode Island's strategy. Next. This is an overall graphic that we've been using to try to bring coherence to our own thinking internally. And so we know that we want our graduates who are ready for the world. They need to think, learn, and act. That's kind of our tagline. And we know that in order to make that happen, that we need to think of at least 3 different categories of work. The one that we're talking about this morning is in pink, the personalized learning, and we begin thinking about that in our early childhood classrooms. What does that look like in PK to 3 classrooms in Rhode Island? What is that foundational learning that allows students to explore different interests more deeply as they progress through the grade levels? We want proficiency-based learning systems to be shaped from the very early grade levels through high school, and we want pathways as a branch of student-centered or personalized learning where students can explore something that they might be interested in academically or as a potential career choice, and I'll talk about that a little bit more later on. But those are kind of the 3 hallmarks of our personalized learning system. We also know for that to work well, oh, can we go back? I'm sorry. We need to have empowered teachers and leaders. So we're doing a tremendous amount of work around shared instructional leadership, teacher, principal, and superintendent leadership. And we're doing a lot of rethinking about what we mean to have ongoing targeted and high-quality professional growth opportunities for all of our educators. And we're working closely with our preparation program so that way candidates who come out are better prepared to implement personalized learning. And the other thing that we've learned is that in order for all of this to work, we need to think about how all of this connects to our accountability systems, like under ESSA. We need to make sure that everyone understands the changes that we're making so it doesn't feel like a threat to those families who think that you know, more traditional coursework and grading systems are a safety net for them. So we want to build that understanding. And I think more broadly in our state, we're using ESSA to change the conversation from one that used to be about compliance and accountability to one that is talking about shared responsibility. And what does that look like for all of us to work well together? And then the blue bar below is, the work that we do within our agency around communication and networking, what policies need to be in place, how can we rethink the use of resources, whether that's time or money, and what kind of guidance and facilitation role do we need to play in order for this to work well. So that's really kind of a very broad framework for the Rhode Island Department of Education. So if we can go on. So all of this began with our strategic plan. So the slide before you was really born out of an 18-month engagement process we use that I think is pretty unprecedented in the country for a state Department of Education. We had over 11,000 people in our state give voice to what was in our strategic plan. And it began in 2015 and will go to 2020. And we wanted to make sure that through the process of developing our strategic plan, it wasn't seen as RIDE's plan, it was really a state plan. So in our strategic plan, and we can send it to you, but it's on our website, we took a lot of care to make sure that it said what will RIDE, the State Department, do, what should the LEAs do, and what can the community do in order to contribute to each element within our strategic plan. And we find ourselves going back to that document very, very often to kind of guide our thinking going forward, because people happily are very wedded to that plan. They're very nervous that ESSA will steer us away from our commitment to fulfilling that strategic plan, and we want to be really clear that nothing will. And happily, proficiency-based learning was really one of the hallmarks of our state plan. So if we can go on to the next slide. In addition to our plan, we have policy that undergirds it. One of them is our basic education program. And our basic education program has been in place since 2009. And it was at that point, under previous leadership, a decision was made to focus less on inputs and more on what needed to be in place at the district and school levels in order to best serve our students. So that document really undergirds all of our thinking, and there are just 4 chapters, one on governance, there's one on student supports, another one on teaching and learning, and another one on finance. And we keep going back to that basic education program, and we make sure that any emerging policy or programs are in full support of that basic education program. And at this point in our state, everyone really understands what that means for them, from our school committees to superintendents and teachers are really anchored to that. Our most recent example of policy that's supporting proficiency-based learning is the revision of our secondary education regulations. Those were first written in 2002 or 3, I believe. And at that time, Rhode Island had 2 statewide learning summits that were called for by our governor at the time. And we brought in business and industry, higher education, the K-12 system, families, students, everyone had a voice to say how did we want to change how kids graduate in our state. And a lot of work started back in those early years. But as you probably also well know, as you have changes in governor or changes in your board or changes in at the commissioner level, how people interpret that set of regulations can really change. So what we've attended to or kind of have been silent about has changed over the years. So most recently, back in 2014, I believe, the regulations were revised slightly so that we had an exit test as part of our graduation requirements, and that was put into our secondary regulations. We had enormous pushback from the community, and there was a law passed to tell us that we couldn't do that. So we've revised our secondary regulations again, and we really went through a process that was very similar to what we did to develop our strategic plan. I led that work. We had, in the end, I think over 50 community meetings with small and large groups to let everyone have voice, to give voice rather to what we wanted for our high school graduates. And they really, really were walking that line between having things personalized and proficiency-based while making sure that we were not forgetting about alignment to standards and making sure that we had rigor. And we continue to kind of balance those, what sometimes feels like competing impulses, when you actually put policy into practice. And I can talk a little bit more about how that tension has led to our current thinking. So if we go on to the next slide, we have things in place to help us let everyone understand how to make this happen. One of them is the League of Innovative Schools that David talked about. Another, and we have, I'm trying to remember how many high schools we have in that. David, do you know?
Yeah, I think it's actually 18, I think, are in Rhode Island.
Okay,
right around
yep.
20.
Yeah, so, and we're a small state, remember guys, I know you're all big states on the phone, but we have 55 high schools in our state. So, you know, as we're getting close to 20, that's really, we're getting to that tipping point. We also have the Highlander Fuse Fellows, which is a more of an emerging body of work in our state. Our governor has a quasi-governmental office that she started called the Innovation Office. And they are charged with coming up with innovative efforts statewide. One of them is working closely with a charter school called the Highlander Charter School, and they're really thinking about blended, personalized, proficiency-based learning. And they have a group of Fuse Fellows who are teachers who are thinking deeply about what it means to use technology in support of proficiency-based, personalized learning in our state. The third one is we have a lot of leadership initiatives. I told you that we're focusing a lot on leadership. So we have offered mini grants to a group of principals, and they're working in partnership with some vetted collaborators like New Leaders, NISL, NATE. We have about 4 or 5 groups that are working with our principals to think about what leadership looks like in this environment. And then we have things like open education resources. You know, how are people making good decisions about uploading materials or reviewing materials, and how do all of those efforts kind of work together in order to lead to better programming for kids. And sometimes it feels like a cacophony of noise, and sometimes it feels like an orchestra. And David and his team and we are working really hard to make it feel more symphonic than just a bunch of noise coming at all of our schools. And one of the ways that we think we can do that is to really focus on proficiency. So if we go to the next slide, and I think even the next one after that. So we're a Common Core state and a next generation science state. And we have our own state standards for social studies and the arts and other areas. And they're really, you know, as you all well know, helpful in thinking about learning expectations within a grade level, within a content area. But people are really struggling about looking at cross-content opportunities and 21st century learning, like applied learning opportunities. And we really want to push that ability to do that kind of work. One of the things that was emerged from our recently revised secondary regulations is we took a lot of time to say you don't need to define a course by seat time and Carnegie units. You really can define courses quite broadly within school, outside of school, as long as you are really certain about what standards that learning opportunity aligns to and how you're measuring learning or proficiency. So that was one of the reasons that proficiency came to the top. The next slide is that we're really committed to flexible and multiple pathways for students. So we have a lot of advanced course work going on, dual and concurrent enrollment, AP courses. We're really pushing career and technical education beyond our more traditional CTE centers so that students are having more opportunities to have internships and working in the field. So we think proficiency is important in that context as well. The third piece is we're really working to make sure that decision-making concerning teaching and learning is happening at close to the classroom as possible. So we are trying to, under Race to the Top, we took on a much more we will tell you what to do and how to do it kind of role. That was really almost necessary out of the way our Race to the Top grant was written. And now we're stepping back and trying to give much more autonomy to the field, saying we'll create the North Star and the guardrails, but then you need to make decisions at the local level. And finally, we think proficiency is important because we think that personalization without proficiency tied to it leads to inequity. So all of the work that we're doing on blended learning and multiple pathways, it could just be the Wild West without really clear, a real clear and shared understanding of what we mean by proficiency. So what's framing our thinking, if we go to the next slide, is we were saying of all the things that we could think about doing, what are those things that are really going to be helpful? What have schools that are kind of ahead of us in this work saying that they need and would like to see, and what are schools who are a little bit further behind saying what they need to help them move toward more proficiency-based learning systems? Another question that we had was how can we ensure that while we're doing this, we maintain that rigor to standards and we achieve equitable outcomes for all students. We have some learning gaps in our state that are just unconscionable, and while we're moving slowly but deliberately to close them, they're still not anywhere where we want them to be. And one of our worries at the state level is that as more schools move to personalization, that could be translated into wider achievement gaps if we're not really, really careful. So we really are trying to be mindful of that. Next slide, please. And I think what the field is struggling with is, this is a little graphic that we've modified. It came out of Learn Zillion with some work that we did with, that we learned about with Washington, D.C. and their cornerstone projects. Historically, in Rhode Island, we were at one end of the spectrum, understanding by design. That was really the way that we developed curriculum. And some districts were all the way on the other end, and they had, particularly in our urban areas, where they had scripted lessons for every day of the year. And we're trying to figure out what is that balance? What can the state do in order to help have a coherent curriculum design linked to standards, but personalize it in such a way that there are clear learning progressions, but that we're providing some guardrails where we are defining some proficiency indicators, and where we might also, kind of in that middle zone, provide some exemplar instructional tasks that might anchor everyone's thinking about how kids are moving through the standards. So if you want to personalize math and you have a high school student who's performing well below, you might want to shore them up, but you've got to make sure that you're doing something to keep them moving so that they don't get so far adrift from where we want them to be in terms of age and grade expectations, that we thought that if we help them by designing anchor tasks, it might help with that decision making. So the next slide is, we've decided that in partnership with David, we were going to develop some K-12 proficiencies, some performance indicators along the way, scoring criteria that people could use. with sample assessment task models, some that we might develop a few, and as models with student work, and then others might be developed at the local level or through other initiatives and shared over time. So we're talking about forming this table that we're calling planning for impact. And so we know that because we have so many different state initiatives going on, that we need to be intentional about how all of these initiatives hold together, so that way we can build on the strengths of each of those separate initiatives. But what will hold them all together are these sample K-12 proficiencies and performance indicators. So that's the work that we're about to start. If you go into the next slide, we're thinking that they will help take what our local curriculum, connected to personalized learning pathways and opportunities, and will also help to strengthen local assessment practices if we get this right. So how are we doing this? We are right now recruiting to get 100 educators, and there could be teachers, principals, curriculum directors, business leaders, and some folks from higher education representing 4 core content areas. And to start with, we really want these sample proficiencies and performance indicators to tie to math, literacy, science, and social studies. But we think it's important that we bring in people from content areas beyond those 4. So world languages or ELL or special education teachers. We want folks from CTE centers and from charter schools all working together. And we want to make sure that in the end, these 100 people represent the entire state. We're going to offer them a $500 stipend, and we will also reimburse the district for, I think, what will be 4 days where they'll be pulled out of school, and then there is some summer work. And they're completing applications. We will be reviewing all those applications, and RIDE staff will be selecting who they are so that we get that balance that we need. And we're hoping that...
And Mary Ann, I think
yeah.
they actually were selected just this morning.
Were they selected this morning?
I got a message from Courtney that you guys were able to identify 88 people, and there are 13 that have also been recommended that they're following up with.
Oh, that's awesome. That's great. Thank you, David. See, you're ahead of it, more ahead of it than I am. So we're really thinking that if we do this right, that not only will they be contributing to the development of these task models and these proficiencies and these indicators, but they will also be ambassadors. They will help to kind of bring that work back into their district, and that they can be our go-to team. Not just for this 1 year, but hopefully with additional funding, that we can they can be our go-to group to make sure that we've got this right, and that we continue to model what it means to be a learning organization by kind of gathering feedback and making ongoing improvements. So I feel like I've just talked and talked and talked. So I will stop here so that way we can go into discussion and questions.
And yes, I'm going to let everyone know we're going to stop the recording now so you can speak freely.